Thanks a lot, Jane. It's really an honor to be at Brazos Bookstore where Oscar Mayer and Larry Flint. But seriously, this is, every writer and every publisher knows that the Brazos is one of the great bookstores in the country, and it's really a privilege to be here. The food and wine and beverages you've been enjoying are compliments of my brother Tom and his wife Teresa, who are standing over there. Thanks a lot, guys, for that. I thought I would just talk a little bit about this book, maybe read a few pages from it, and maybe answer a few questions if anybody has anything to ask about it. This book is called Remember Ben Clayton. It's about a sculptor who is building creating, or whatever the exact word, sculpting a statue of a kid who was killed in World War I. And this book came about, Jane had mentioned I used to be, and still write for Texas Monthly, but I used to be on the staff, and that was my day job. And for many years, in fact, Texas Monthly's founding editor, Bill Broyles' mother, is here, Betty Broyles, so we're very pleased to have her here. And you know, Texas Monthly has meant a lot to me over the years, and one of the things it's meant to me is it's given me so much material as a writer, because you know, while I was working on story after story, I was constantly searching for something to write about next. And one day I was thinking, I noticed that, this was like 25 years ago, I noticed that almost every statue I saw in Texas was by the same guy, a guy named Pompeo Capini. If any of you went to UT or visited UT, you've seen the Littlefield Fountain, you know, with the kind of berserk statue with the horses rearing out of the water with their hooves shaped like fins. All the statues on the South Mall, which is so controversial now because you have Robert E. Lee and George Washington and James Hogg, and those were all done by Capini. The cenotaph in front of the Alamo with the carvings of the Alamo heroes on it was Capini's work. Many statues in San Antonio, the statues at the Hall of State in Dallas of Bonham and Travis and Bowie were all done by Capini, and he was this Italian-American sculptor who, with a giant ego, who lived in San Antonio off and on. And it was really fun to write about him, and fun to write about his work, because it's so vivid, and his life was kind of, you know, chaotic in an interesting way. But while I was researching the story, I read his autobiography, which is called From Dawn to Sunset, and it's about 1,000 pages long. And I came across a reference to a statue I hadn't heard about before, and it was a statue of a young man who was killed in 1917 in a fall from a horse. And you can see that statue today on the courthouse square of Ballinger, Texas. It's a really beautiful piece of work. I think it's his best statue. It's just it's nothing special. It's just a young man in a cowboy hat standing next to a horse. And in his autobiography, Capini talks about how that statue came to be. He got a telegram one day when he was living in San Antonio from this old rancher out in Menard County whose son had died in a fall from a horse. And he was bereaved and grief-stricken, and he wanted to create some memorial to his son. And Capini talked about taking the train out to Menard County, getting off, I can't remember which town it was, and going to this rancher's house, which was this very humble, you know, remote place in the middle of a ranch. And the guy was very sorrowful and, you know, quiet, and he took Capini out to a sort of a bluff where he wanted the statue to be. And Capini then writes about, you know, the tears streaming down this guy's cheeks, and then himself, Capini, spending that night in the son's room in this, you know, really not much more than a sod house out on the plains, and you know, sleeping in this dead boy's room with his saddle, his empty saddle against the wall. And I read that 1 or 2 paragraph passage in this gigantic book just really moved me. And I thought, you know, maybe there's a novel in here somewhere. Maybe there's a story that I could conjure up about a sculptor trying to create a statue of a young man who died. So I sort of let that go for about 20 years and just, you know, note, you know, somewhere, art novel about statue. And finally, it just, you know, it was time to write something else, and I was looking for something that would, you know, make sense to me as a book. And that came back into my mind, and I started to think about it and decided I'd like to do that. That would be interesting because I'm very interested in statues to begin with. I'm on the board of Capital Area Statues in Austin, which is a group that raises money and commissions statues. We did, I don't know if any of you have ever been to Barton Springs Pool. There's a statue of J. Frank Dobie, Roy Bedicek, and Walter Prescott Webb sitting on a rock in their bathing suits. That was our statue, and we did the one on Congress Avenue of Angelina Eberly shooting off a cannon. I hate to tell this story in Houston, but the reason that statue exists is because there was this woman named Angelina Eberly who in 1842 woke up in the middle of the night when she heard the Texas Rangers, under the direction of Sam Houston, stealing the government archive from what was then the Republic of Texas, an independent nation. And the archives were really all the capital was. And Houston wanted the archives in a more congenial city like Houston. And Angelina would have nothing of it, and she shot off this cannon and blew a hole in the land office building, thus scaring off the Rangers, immortalizing herself as the patron saint of archivists everywhere, and is sort of the savior of the capital of Texas for Austin, which I know in Houston is not, yeah, something we don't celebrate so much.
Oh, you can have it.
Yeah, actually, right now I think you could definitely.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I had this interest in statues. By the way, we're doing Willie Nelson next, and he's going to be. I'm flying to Philadelphia in a couple of weeks to do the final inspection on the statue, and it'll be up in September or October, I think.
Where is that one going to go?
It's going to go in downtown Austin, right, kind of in front of City Hall, or it's in this new development. But anyway, so by virtue of my interest in statues and my interest in this story, I decided to write this novel. And after reading Capini's book, he himself had sort of exhausted me as a character. He was so opinionated, so, you know, had such a high opinion of himself, and I just kind of was worn out by him. So I sort of took him out of my fictional story and put in my own sculptor. Because I just wanted to write about somebody different. And when I started to think about it, I thought, you know, this is around the time of World War I. What if the boy was killed not in a ranch accident, but in the war? And so that led me down all sorts of interesting paths. And I started to ask friends of mine who were in the National Guard and places like that, if a kid had been in the American Expeditionary Force in World War I and had died, and he was from, I set the ranch in Shackelford County around Abilene and Albany. I said if he had died and had come from this part of the state, where would he have died? And my friend I was asking, I said, oh, Saint Etienne. And he took me to the Camp Mabry, the National Guard camp in Austin, where they have a little military history museum. And there's actually a diorama of the Battle of Saint Etienne, this tiny little town in the Champagne in the northeastern France, near the Western Front, where the 36th Infantry had a major confrontation with the Germans. And it was a lot of medals of honor were won there, but it's a forgotten little battlefield. And I went over to France to see it twice. Sue Ellen and I, my wife, were in France, and we spent a long, long day looking for this battlefield and barely found it. It's not really marked. It's just an old village, tiny little village in France, with a bunch of sugar beet fields in front of it. But I went back a year later with a World War I battlefield guide, and we walked through this area and found, he looked for where the machine gun nest would have been, looked for where the trenches were, actually found a grenade on the ground from World War I. So that became very vivid to me as I began reading all these old journals and diaries and battle reports of what it would have been like to be at that place. And then I start, and I'm a sort of research-intensive novelist. I can't, I guess it's all the training of being a reporter and a magazine journalist, but I just sort of dived deep into these subjects. So I started talking to a lot of sculptors. How do you make a statue? What's that like? What's the process like from the initial phases to the actual, casting of the bronze statue? Had to learn a little bit about ranch life, about life in Texas in 1920, about life in New York in 1920, and life in Paris in 1920. So it was an exciting book to research. It took me all the way to Abilene and all the way to Paris, which was, it was good to see those twin poles of civilization. And so that's the book. It turned out to be a book about a sculptor who is sort of in an artistic exile from New York, who has always had these great dreams for himself as an artist, and they've never quite been met, owing partly to just bad fortune, but partly to his own arrogance in some ways and his own pride. And it's about him and his daughter, who is a grown woman who is kind of his studio assistant, but is also itching to get out from under his shadow. And it's about this rancher who has this very complicated and haunted relationship with the son he's trying to memorialize. And I thought I'd read just a couple pages, and this is the scene in the book kind of describing, keying off from what I was talking about earlier about the sculptor coming to the ranch and meeting and spending the night in the son's room. There's not a whole lot you have to know at this point. The sculptor, whose name is Gill, Francis Gilhaney, it's called Gill, and has met Lamar Clayton, who's the rancher, and Gill and his daughter Maureen are at the ranch. They've met Clayton. They've come up with a deal for doing the statue for $16,000. Clayton has taken them out to a little mesa where he wants the statue to be, and then this is what happens that night after everybody goes to bed. He spent that night in the boys' room, one of the two rooms that formed the original stone core of the house. There was a single small window through which he could see a hazy full moon that looked like a giant dissolving aspirin tablet high in the West Texas sky. On either side of the window at shoulder height were two indentations that passed all the way through the thick wall, funneling down to small circles that were open to the night air. It took Gill a minute or two to puzzle out what they were, shooting holes, to fight off Comanches during the not-so-distant days of the Indian Wars. Ben Clayton's saddle sat on a sawhorse on one end of the room. It seemed a bit old-fashioned in a way Gill did not have the expertise to judge, something to do with the straight, high-backed cantle. There was no ornamentation, no silver inlays or intricate tooling, just solid leather. The working saddle of an earnest, unaffected young man, a plain-spoken American martyr. Or perhaps that was the way Gill was already seeing his subject, because he preferred to think of his own style and hence his own substance as unadorned as well. No simpering cherubs commenting from the ether, no bombast or symbolic blather, a minimum of the decorative vines and garlands that were known in the trade as spinach. He would use this saddle in the statue, of course, not merely for its authenticity, but for the pleasure it would give him to sculpt something so austere and worn. When Lamar Clayton had shown him to his room after dinner, he had pointed out the saddle and the other vestiges of his son's life that he had been too paralyzed with sadness to do anything with but leave in place. A picture of Ben's mother and father's wedding day rested in a silver frame on an empty spool that had served as the dead boy's end table. In the photograph, Lamar was 20 years younger and a few pounds heavier, his hair streaked with gray, but not yet white. But there was no more buoyancy in his expression than there had been at the dinner table tonight. He must have been 50 in this photograph, Gil supposed. Why had he taken so long to marry? His new wife, dressed in a traveling suit, her hand gripping the crook of his arm, was slender and winning, beaming at the camera as if she were in possession of a wonderful secret about her dour husband. It was a better quality likeness of Ben's mother than the one Clayton had shown them earlier, and it made Gil rueful to think about how the only people in this little family with a glint of vivacity were now dead. By the light of the kerosene lamp, he sorted through the young man's war memorabilia, scant enough to fit into a shirt box. Most of it seemed to be from his training at Camp Bowie. The pamphlet called Songs for the Height, a blank postcard from the Westbrook Hotel in Fort Worth displaying a photograph of a not very good statue called the Golden Goddess, a souvenir folder of camp life whose cover depicted a group of doughboys engaged in bayonet drill and whose pages were mostly blank. Under My Division, Ben, Gil assumed it was Ben, had written 36th, and under My Regiment, he had penciled in 142nd. But after that, he must have lost interest or become annoyed at being prompted about what to enter, because the spaces for My Company and My Training Log were left blank, as were all the rest of the pages. There were 3 postcards, all from Camp Bowie. Dear all, one read. Well, I escaped getting my wisdom teeth pulled by one of the dental students they got here. They said there's no reason to worry about mine. Ortho Cotton got his pulled and now his jaw's swelled up pretty bad. If somebody has the time, could you send me that extra quilt after all? These blankets are thin and it would save me having to go buy another one in Fort Worth. How's Poco? Ben. Poco was his horse. The other postcards were equally brief and chatty. He enjoyed working in the pit on the rifle range. He was getting pretty tired of hearing the tops whistle all day long. He finally could manage right shoulder arms without knocking his hat off. Everybody in his squad had gotten tested for hookworm and passed with flying colors. And that was all, except for a telegram at the bottom of the box from the Adjutant General's office, deeply regretting to inform Mr. Lamar Clayton that his son, Private Benjamin Clayton of the 36th Division, 142nd Infantry Regiment, had been officially reported killed in action near the village of Saint-Étienne-Arne. The telegram was followed by an apologetic letter from the Chief of the Graves Registration Service, pledging to inform families as soon as possible, quote, as to the present resting places of their noble dead who glorify the nation's roll of honor. Lamar Clayton had directed Gil to the shirt box, saying that's where his son's letters were stored. But was this all? Surely the boy had written home from France. Perhaps he had even kept a diary. But Gil could find nothing else. The traces of Ben Clayton's life in this room were sorrowfully palpable. But as a sculptor, Gil needed more. He needed to know who this young man had been, and that key knowledge did not seem to be on offer, either in the artifacts surrounding him in this room or in the terse testimony of his father. Gil wanted his subject to be visible, and it troubled him in an obscure way that an emotional portrait of Ben Clayton had not yet begun to present itself to him, except, of course, for the profound emotion of loss, the death of promise, which would be the unstated theme of his statue. From the moment he first stood on top of that mesa, he knew that this piece was what he had been searching for. It had the potential to turn his life in Texas from one of artistic exile to one of liberation. $16,000 or $20,000 didn't matter. This was a theme that had the power to bring forth the greatness he knew was still within his grasp. He was irritated with himself that he had not traveled with a few of his sculpting tools and a block of plastilina so that he could make a proper three-dimensional sketch. The drawing would have to do for now. He took out his pencils and a pad of paper from his valise and went to work at Ben Clayton's boyhood desk, under the imperfect light of the lamp. The statue would be, more than anything, calm. As calm in its way as the beautifully eerie memorial St. Gaudens had done for Henry Adams' wife. As a younger man, Gill had once stood in front of St. Gaudens' hooded female figure, nearly weeping at its plangent mystery and at the shivering inspiration that underlay its artistry. He sensed a similar opportunity here, an opportunity for something glorious and enduring. He sketched rapidly. It was the work of 10 minutes. Lamar Clayton's idea of the statue was of Ben on horseback, but Gill swiftly rejected the father's vision and supplanted it with his own. A young man, dismounted in death, standing beside a beloved horse, looking out across the landscape of his childhood. When he was finished, Gill held the drawing closer to the light. It was enough, not a pencil stroke more. And the finished statue, he knew, would be similarly spare. The challenges were all in the proportions, in the posture of man and horse, and the fidelity and detail of the face. It was after midnight before he finally turned off the lamp and climbed into the narrow bed upon which Ben Clayton had slept for most of his short life. Moonlight flowed in through the small window, and even from the 2 shooting holes, helping to endow the saddle on the opposite end of the room with a seductive physicality. He heard the profound, reverberant notes of an owl's voice as the bird made its rounds on silent wing beats from tree to tree around the house. He heard as well the snorting and stamping of horses from the nearby stable. And from the unimaginable distances of the night came the anxious, cascading calls of coyotes. These were the sounds, Gill noted, that would have ushered Ben into sleep from his earliest childhood. So different, surely, from what he had listened to in France during the last nights of his life. And so the rest of the book is really about Gill trying to find out who Ben was and why he died and how he died. And there's a lot of stuff that, that happens from this point forward. A lot of stuff that's happened back in time that we catch up to, involving Lamar and his past. So I won't bore you with all that. But if anybody had any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Or if you don't want to ask any, we could just adjourn.
Well, I think our contemporary perspective on World War I, it's taken us a long time to get there, is that that's the war we shouldn't have fought. That's the war we shouldn't have been in, and I'm wondering if that enters into the book.
It doesn't really. It's just the book's a little fatalistic that way. I think, it just sort of takes what happened as a given. I mean, I think that's a really fascinating discussion, whether we should have been involved in that war or any war. But it's what motivated Ben to be involved in that war is personal. There's a mention of the Zimmerman telegram in the book, which was a contrivance that the Germans ginned up to try to get Mexico involved. But it's really, these people who the book is about are not political in that way. I mean, Gill Lamar is an old trail driver, and he just takes these things as they come, and what's come is tragedy for him. And I don't think the war in these characters' minds was thought out. And we could argue that the war in the nation's mind was not thought out either. It just happened. But it's, I think you could read this book and make your own interpretations about whether there's an implied or implicit criticism of that war or not. But I don't know what it is. I'm just following the characters. Yeah.
I just want to make a comment that I really liked your line about the death of a young person as the death of promise. I think it's a really beautiful way to say that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's it is obviously true. I guess it's just. So thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah.
I understand from reading other things about you that you've really gotten into this whole sculpture thing. And I was curious if you knew anything about the work of Frederick Rick Hart in D.C., the guy who did the soldiers statue across from the Vietnam Memorial.
Well, there's the soldier statue, and then
all the Washington Cathedral stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's the sort of triptych of those three guys at the Vietnam Memorial, and then on the other end of that is the Women in Vietnam Memorial, which was done by Glenna Goodacre, who did our statue in Austin.
Oh, really?
Our Philosopher's Rock, the one with Dobie Bedichek and Webb. So I occupied myself mostly with sculptors from this time, like St. Gaudens and people like that, who was kind of Gill's hero. Daniel Chester French, who's a little later, but still around. And but yeah, I mean, I'm aware of those guys, and there's a whole interesting discussion about in the world of sculpture, where are statues? How are they perceived today when everything is abstract and impressionistic? And you've got people like Richard Serra with these big giant hunks of metal, and then a statue of just a likeness of somebody seems kind of quaint and ancient, but it's really still stirring to me. To me, there's just something miraculous in the human ability to create somebody's face and that we can recognize it. And when you see a really great statue like the one I referred to in here from St. Gaudens, the memorial to Henry Adams' wife in Washington, I mean, it's like hearing a great symphony. I mean, it's representational. It's you can't figure out where it takes off into art exactly at what place, but it's just there. It's really remarkable. Any other questions? Yeah.
You reference a bronze statue, I think, that Gill had done that was a tribute to the Alamo. And the only statue I can think of is that one, the white one that's out in front there. Is that a fictitious statue?
Yeah, I was really playing loose and fast. I mean, I figured, okay.
It was racking my brain.
I know this would cause, I knew I'd get asked this question, but he's a fictional character, so therefore these statues can't be real. But I just wonder, like one of the early scenes of the book is this big race riot in Omaha where he has this statue called the Pawnee Scout that he's trying to protect from these rioters. And, I'm sure everybody in Omaha knows there was never a statue of a Pawnee Scout on the lawn of the courthouse. But it was kind of fun to invent these statues, they were kind of the statues that I thought these places ought to have, So and after writing a whole book about the Alamo, I had a pretty good idea of where you ought to put a Davy Crockett statue, what you ought to be doing. So I hope people aren't, I hope people don't buy a plane ticket and fly to San Antonio to see the statue described in the book because it's not there. But I had fun with that. But I don't know. I couldn't attribute somebody else's statues to him. So. Anything else? If there are,
sure. I'm just curious. Since you did the last veteran from World War I only died a few years ago, and I'm just curious if you had any chance to talk to anybody firsthand about their experience over there.
Well, I'm old enough to have wasted those potential experiences I could have had. Yeah. I had a teacher in college who was supposed to be teaching us science, but it was one of those classes where English majors could get out of their science credit by I think it was called physical science, and all he talked about was being gassed in the trenches in World War I, and he never talked about physics or anything. But I was just so not engaged. I just was ready to get out of class, and so I didn't pay as much attention as I should have. So now I'm just kicking myself. But yeah, I mean, there are no more World War I veterans. There's nobody who can tell us about this. And I've met people. I met a woman a couple of years ago who remembered her father coming home from the war, and the big parade and stuff like that. But even those people are getting pretty old. So I've squandered the opportunity, but we all have those kind of things. Yeah. anything else? If not, I'd be happy to sign anybody's book. I don't know where we're supposed to do this.
I'm gonna bring you a stool and you're gonna sit right there.
Okay, that's easy.
How's that?
Yeah, great.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
everybody, for coming. Thanks, Tom and Teresa, for